My name is Stephen Adly Guirgis. I'm a playwright and actor from New York City, and we are heading downtown across the bridge to Brooklyn to visit Mr. John Patrick Shanley. Oscar winner, Tony winner, Pulitzer Prize winner, Bronx Hall of Fame. John is the author of like 25 or more plays, including Danny the Deep Blue Sea, Doubt. He's the screenplay penner of Moonstruck. I'm really psyched to go talk to him. I was introduced to Shanley's work. I think I just like stumbled on a play, and it was Danny the Deep Blue Sea. And I read it, and in the long run, it changed my life. Reading John at the age I did gave me a focus that was absent in my life, and I know I'm not the only one. So it's not a stretch to say in some cases that his plays have saved lives. One component of who John is as a writer is he's a truth teller. Whether you like the truth or don't like the truth, he's brave enough to lay whatever it is on the table for people to take it or leave it. All right, Mr. Shanley. What's up, man?
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
How's everything?
Good. Welcome to my humble home.
Thank you. Oh, man.
Feel free to run amok.
Thank you, man. Oh, didn't your son take that photo?
Yeah, he did. My son Nick took that, and down in Del Rio, Texas, when he was on a trip investigating his roots.
Oh, man, it's talented.
He is.
Oh, and I see you got some awards in a nice, non-showy place, but yet they're here.
Yeah.
What do we got here?
You got an Oscar, a Tony, a Pulitzer.
And what's the little book next to it?
I think it's just a little book.
Oh, Memoirs of Casanova.
One of my favorite pieces of literature. It's, I cried when it was over.
Wow.
Because it basically stops in the middle of a paragraph, because that's when he died.
Really?
Yeah. Autobiographies, you know, the real, genuine article.
Yeah.
You never get to finish them. This is the room where I do work.
Nice.
Yeah, you can distract yourself with the Williamsburg Bridge and sit in some kind of ergonomic chair and my ergonomic keyboard.
Do you have any objects here that you always have to have around?
I have many objects. I always have to have a piece of this hardwood around since I was a child. My brother brought it home from Morocco, that kind of wood, and it's always been a great thing for me since.
Nice.
I have a little lapis lazuli turtle and various rocks, many rocks.
I like it. Where are the rocks from? Any from Pawleys Island?
It's not that they're from Pawleys Island, it's that I like these rocks.
Okay.
This is a moon rock icon, because I think this really does look like the moon. Somewhere I have a Bronx Walk of Fame where they named a street
I was
after
with
me.
you.
I know.
Remember I split my pants and I wasn't wearing underwear?
Yeah.
And you gave me your underwear.
I gave you my underwear. And a bond like that.
It's never
It's
broken.
lifelong. It's
Yeah,
just,
I mean...
Here's another, there's a rock, but I also use them for, I prop open the door and the wind blows through it. It keeps all the papers from going all over.
Nice rock.
Yeah. It's, you know, it reminds me of beef fat, this part of it.
All right, you ready for some penetrating questions?
I want you to break through all of my defenses.
So tell me, how did you end up as a playwright? Is this something that you suspected or never suspected? What was that process like for you?
Well, I certainly didn't suspect it. I mean, I grew up in the Bronx, and I'd never met a playwright. I'd never met anybody in the arts. But I was always writing. I was writing from the time I was about 10. I wrote poetry and little stories and stuff like that.
And was there like a family history of writing little poetry yourself?
No, there was nothing. My father was a meat packer. My mother was a telephone operator. I'm the youngest of 5 children. I'm the only one ever to graduate from college. And everybody in my family, except my father, was a kind of voracious reader of all sorts of different stuff. But I was the only one who became a writer or wrote, and that was from the beginning. It was congenital.
And how did it evolve into playwriting?
Well, after I got out of the Marine Corps, I'd gone to college for a year and dropped out, and I went back to NYU, and I liked writing, so I would take any writing courses they had, and the only one left that I hadn't taken was Introduction to Playwriting. So I took that, and as soon as I started to write dialogue, I realized that this is what I was going to do. I could say something about that time that I could still say now, which was I had a gift and I couldn't control it. So I started writing plays when I was about 23, just experiments, really. And they were mostly produced in small theaters around New York, but nothing ever came of any of them. And I guess in retrospect, I didn't want anything to come of them. I needed to wander in this strange overgrown garden called off Broadway.
Yeah. You seem to exude, a reasonable amount of confidence and self-assuredness. But I wonder, what have you wrestled with? What in the process of becoming a writer has been your biggest struggle?
It's almost all struggle. It's almost all in the sense, sometimes I'll do something without a thought in my head that turns out to be really good.
Yeah.
Like Doubt. I just sat down and wrote Doubt, and I made a few changes in rehearsal, but basically it just appeared, But it appeared out of years of struggling on a conscious level. And then meanwhile, there's these two narratives going on all the time, your unconscious narrative and your conscious narrative. And my consciousness anyway is about this big, and my unconscious is enormous. And I am the steward of my unconscious. I work for it. It does not work for me. And it has made that apparent on many, many, many occasions. So I struggle with structure, storytelling. I wrote a play about 3 or 4 years ago that I did up at New York Stage and Film at Vassar called The Danish Widow. And I got into rehearsal with that. And very quickly in rehearsal, I realized that I had violently overwritten the play, which shocked me. I'm like, shouldn't I by now know when I've overwritten? But what plot is, I've always said, that to me is the biggest mystery. Why something is moving the story forward and why something isn't, for some reason, is very hard for me to decipher on occasion. Like, why isn't this part story and why is this part story? I did a play called Defiance at Manhattan Theater Club, a play about the Marine Corps and about the military back in the 70s. And when I got into previews, I looked at the play and I thought, this play starts 3 scenes in. And then it was really good, but that's too late. It has to start in the first scene. And I thought that in equal parts, I found that upsetting and really fascinating.
And Defiance followed Doubt. Did you feel pressure in the follow-up?
No, I knew I was going to fail. So,
You really did?
Yeah, because in other words, I might not think that the next play is going to fail.
Right.
But I know I'm going to write a whole bunch more, and that, my batting average is probably 40, 50% at the most.
Wow.
And let's get on with it. Like what I learned in high school in Cardinal Spellman in the Bronx was I could not control the fact that I was going to fail some of my courses. But what I could control was I can fail all of my courses, and then I'm in charge. And so I just went ahead and failed everything. And then I was free. And in the vast expanse that failure provides, then you can really succeed.
This sounds like it's a philosophy that worked for you, but wouldn't a teacher be able to say, no, you are in control of you don't have to fail any of your classes if you just do what the fuck you're supposed to do.
Yeah, but in other words, I was not that person.
So you were aware that you weren't capable of...
My unconscious was incredibly powerful. And it simply was not going to sit there and listen to the algebra teacher.
Right.
And so, you know, I was going to be reading Lord of the Rings under the desk, or Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, or Oliver Twist, or whatever the hell I was reading that week. And because I very much needed an education, but it was not the education that I was being provided.
And yet, you know, some years later, you're valedictorian at NYU.
It was a different era of my life.
Well, and different how?
Well, I'd gone in the Marine Corps, and I'd come out much more disciplined and much more focused. And one of the great things about the military is you give up all control of your outer life, which creates a freedom inside. It's like being in a certain kind of monastery. And so when I got out, I had it in my body to get up at a certain time and that I would go right to work on something. And so I got up and I wrote for 3 hours every day and then went off to my job. And so then when I went back to NYU, maybe a year after that, I just kept the practice up and I would write all my papers and everything. I'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write for 3 hours and then go out for a 3-mile run and then go to school.
Right.
And my day, my productive day, was done by 9 o'clock in the morning. And the rest was gravy. So I had a really good time in college. And I had a 4.0 for the whole time I was there.
Oh, man, we're so different. but so you had success right out of the gate. And in different periods of your life and your career, you have experienced success on a really high level, pretty young, you know, winning an Oscar, winning the Pulitzer Prize, you know, winning a Tony, you know, you've gone through. What have you learned from success, and what pitfalls have you stepped in or learned to avoid along the way?
Well, winning is easy. In other words, when you win, I remember when I won the Oscar, I was a second to last category, so I had to sit there through 3 hours waiting for my category. And then when they called my name, I didn't know up until that moment. I'm like, do I think I'm going to win this, or do I think I'm not going to win this? And then they called my name, and I was shocked. And I realized that I had completely prepared myself that I was not going to win, and I was comfortable with that. And then as I walked down the aisle, I thought, this is easy. Winning is easy. And everything else is hard. So it's a fun day. It's a great day. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. But, you know, it's like when I graduated from NYU and I was valedictorian of all the schools of the university, and I spoke to, you know, an audience of 5,000 in Washington Square Park on a PA system that would have been good for Adolf Hitler. And great day, you know? And then I stayed at NYU for another year as a teaching fellow. And halfway through my master's, I stopped one day and went, I'm educated. And I left, and I became a bartender at a brew burger on 34th Street. And all of the sort of trappings of you have been so successful fell away, and I was completely impoverished and obscure and fighting to get through the week in a way that made some kind of sense. And writing my little plays and putting them on to complete failure for a decade. And that's the norm.
Yes.
And then after all of that time, I did Danny in the Deep Blue Sea at Actors Theater of Louisville with John Turturro and June Stein. And when at the end of that performance, and the whole audience stood up and started cheering and openly weeping, and I did too, I thought, this is what I was after. I wanted to do a play that got this kind of reaction. I wanted to do a play that brought the whole audience and a discerning audience to their feet unreservedly. And then I thought, I'm 34. That was my life's goal. What now?
Right.
And that was really interesting and freeing. I was freed from the servitude of trying to make that happen. I'd made it happen. And so now, you know, now what was I gonna do? And other things presented themselves, like making a living.
And then, so what was that like for you?
Well, I had the first straight job I ever had, which was working for Dramatists Play Service as the person who handled their professional rights for plays. And I did that for a year, and then I quit to go and do Danny when it came to New York. And yeah, I didn't make any money doing Danny. I made like $5,000. And that was about to run out, and I got a National Endowment for the Arts grant for $17,000. And I thought, well, I better use this money to write a film, because if I don't, in 1 year, I'll be painting people's apartments again. And so I read a bunch of screenplays, and I watched a bunch of movies and thought, how would you write this? Most specifically, James Bond. I was like, how would you write this? And then I wrote my first screenplay, which was Five Corners.
It's great, such a great movie.
And, I just thought about it and, how do you do this? And I thought, well, let me think about my childhood and think about what I would like to photograph. And the images from my childhood, no dialogue, that I remember, that were burned into my memory as things that I would like to see on film. And so I came up with all of these images of a Saint Bernard and of penguins that had been beaten to death in a fountain and a bunch of other stuff. And then I was like, now what story do all of these images suggest? And I started to build a story, like 4 or 5 scenes at a time. I would outline like 3 to 5 scenes in advance, just on a piece of paper, and it would just be what the scene was going to be. And then at the end of the screenplay, when all of these stories, these parallel stories came together, I burst into tears. Because I didn't see it coming. And yet I had been the engineer of it.
Yeah.
And I knew I'd done something.
I think the first film to portray a son throwing his mother out the window.
Well, I asked my parents at one point if they'd seen my first film, and my mother said, no, I hadn't seen it. So why didn't you go and see it? And she said, well, I understand that a mother's thrown out the window in that film. And I said, yes. And I thought, I guess she knows.
Talk a little bit about your relationship with your mother, and how you have been able or unable to sort of exercise demons through, the creative act and writing.
I loved my mother, and I wanted her to be happy. And she was never going to be happy. And I felt that what stood between her and happiness was her worldview, which was that she saw the world as an utterly unmagical place. And I saw the world as an utterly magical place. And that struggle I took out of my home and into my life. And as an artist, I showed as many people as I knew how to that the world was a magical place. And that's a better way to see the world. That you're going to have a better experience of life if you see the world in that way. And when I wrote my first screenplay, I had a mother in there who had an utterly magical view of the world, with a brass tacks son who'd been driven mad by her denial of same.
That's interesting.
And finally, he picks her up and throws her out the window after she finally has one moment where they share on the same plane. And what he knows is, it's never going to get this good again. So let me offer right now.
It's interesting. I think what you described was like how you might have employed the idea of a mother. It's not literal to your life, but that you take something to put a twist in it, an inversion in this, and that makes it something completely different.
Or I'm twisted. I don't have to put the twist in it.
Yeah.
The twist is there. The problem that writers have is they get conventional. They want to make believe that they don't have a twist in them.
Right.
And that makes this writing flat.
If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to Danny, which was my introduction to your work. And I've said it before, and I don't mean to flatter, but you're my favorite playwright. And that play just blew me away. It still blows me away. And so my question is, can you talk just a little bit about how much of where it came from, how much of it was you, how much of it You know, where does autobiography and the imagination meet? You know,
Well, you know, I mean, I grew up in this neighborhood in the Bronx, and it had a lot of violent, disaffected people in it, especially guys. And guys who just didn't fit in anywhere. And I felt like I understood these guys. And I felt that they were sort of the outward embodiment of a lot of things that I felt. Danny is a guy who works on as a moving man on a truck, and I worked as a moving man on a truck. And I was the odd man out for different reasons than Danny is. But I contained all those never extinguished fires of rage and alienation that I grew up with. I contained all those things, and I didn't really know where to put those things in daily life. So I was very lonely in the Bronx. I was very lonely after the Bronx. And I dated a girl up there who I could just see tragedy written all over her. And I styled the girl Roberta in Danny on her, and I felt her, you know. There's some people, and I know that you have this experience, there's some people and you just go like, I can conjure that person anytime and they can talk forever. And she was one of those people for me. I could conjure at any time. And I could conjure Danny at any time for the same purpose. It's sort of like that part in the Odyssey where Odysseus goes to the edge of the land of the dead, and one by one they drink from the cup of blood and they can speak for a time. And to me, in a way, that's what playwriting is you're surrounded by these hovering ghosts, and if you give them a cup of your blood, they will speak to you for a while, and you can talk to Achilles, or you can talk to Agamemnon, or you can talk to Danny in the Deep Blue Sea. Yeah.
And so if I'm a young playwright and I'm hearing these words and I'm saying like, well, there's no ghosts around me. What do I have to do to get the ghosts around me? And how do I hear them speak? What do you say to that?
Well, you know, it's sort of like when a person they're having that feeling, they think there's no ghosts around them and everything else. But if they stop and think about it, they'll do something and they hear a voice in their head and said, that was stupid. And that's an alien voice. And it's probably the voice of their mother or father or sister or brother, familial figure. And one by one, you need to cast those voices not out of your life, but outside of you, and argue with them and reason with them and kill them and bring them back to life again. And one by one, you'll realize that you are teeming with alien voices if you're a playwright.
Yeah.
And you do have to have an ear. But what is a good ear? A good ear is that you can hear the voices that are out there. And then if you're going to be a good playwright, you have to discern between, in other words, I'm a radio. I can sit down right now and I can write a full-length play. That doesn't mean it's going to be any good. But I can sit around and listen to those voices and then once in a blue moon go like, wait a minute, that's an interesting voice. I want to follow. That voice is going somewhere and I want to follow and see where it goes.
So again, if I'm a young writer and I'm trying to gain information, I'm like, okay. Shanley said, yeah, I know that voice that he's talking about, the voice of the critic or the voice of the mother, and I can have an argument with that. But how do I get past just having voices?
I think it's actually a process of winnowing down the number of voices. I mean, we're living in a time of incredible noise.
Yeah.
And so why would you say, I will now pay attention to this one voice or this one idea or this one question to the exclusion of everything else and let everything be drawn to that. You know, so people very often want to write like a big play, big novel, big movie that's like about America,
Right.
or is about, you know, totalitarianism, and it's paralyzing. But if you write a play about a dog, you know, that you know, the whole world will hover around that dog. And you can write about all of those things through writing very specifically about the dog and never writing anything that is larger. Just be very specific about, you know, what that story is that you're telling and let the story be as big as it is. Don't try to make it bigger than it is. off of that, you have to recognize that it's not all about you in order to be a playwright. And I know that an observation that's been made many times about William Shakespeare is that he's not in his plays. And it's really kind of true, except maybe Hamlet. And it's a tremendous strength. No subject hemmed him in. All of them freed him. He found a way that no matter who the character was, that he was not inhibited. That's what I mean by freedom. When I was 22, I met Marshall McLuhan, a great communications theorist. And the way that he talked, the conversation that we had, suddenly made me free. Because he described, like saying statements, he called them probes. And I thought that's a great way to think about it. Then I don't have to be permanently wedded to anything I say. I can try things on and see how far I can take them. And it reminds you, it's like, oh yes, yes, you can write about anything.
In terms of like stages of writing and stages of your career, I know Danny was received successfully. Do subsequent plays received successfully as well?
Well, you know, the next play I did after Danny and the Deep Blue Sea was Savage in Limbo. And I thought that I had done Danny, and so that now the door was open. And no one wanted to do Savage in Limbo, except some kids who were just starting a theater company at Poughkeepsie in Vassar, and they were the only people who wanted to produce that play.
Wow.
And so we did it, and because it was the inaugural season and they didn't really know what they were doing yet, they gave us 8 weeks of rehearsal. And I had a stellar cast, and we did it first up there, and then we did it in New York City, up in Midtown. And it was one of the most electrifying productions I've ever had. And the audience went crazy every night. And it got terrible reviews. And I didn't care. I didn't care at all. And that gave me somewhere in there, I'm like, it just doesn't matter. And then I did The Dreamer Examines His Pillow. And again, not one good word. Like the New York Times hated Savage in Limbo, hated Dreamer Examines His Pillow. And then I did Moonstruck. And the New York Times hated Moonstruck, not one good word in the review. And the basis of the criticism was, this is not what Italian people are really like. And then the movie went to #1 in Rome. And then they wrote a second review and said it was a classic. I never mentioned the first review again. And that opened my eyes to something as well. As Elizabeth Taylor once said, there's no perfume like success. And then I did Italian-American Reconciliation. And lo and behold, New York Times gave me a good review.
That's great.
You know, the door doesn't open, you have to kick it down.
So let me ask you this then. When you see something new from somebody young, what are the components that makes you go, oh, this person's a writer?
5 good minutes. You know, I'm not looking for what doesn't work. Most things don't work. And I'm not just talking about plays. Most people, you know, most of them don't work. But maybe there's one part that's really alive and operating, and that's the part that interests me. And when I watch a play, a film, and respond to any kind of work of art, I am looking for the part that works. That's what I'm looking for. When somebody talks to me about my work, talk to me about the part that works, because I'll know what you're saying. I'll know you're saying 95% of this doesn't work, but the part that does work is this.
I don't know if I've ever been able to like peek under the curtain and be like, oh, he constructed this. Why? It always feels like it's coming straight out of the moment.
Yeah, and sometimes that illusion takes a lot of work to achieve. Sometimes it doesn't, you know. Sometimes it does come out that way. But a lot of the times, you know, the whole point is to make it natural. and natural within the specific universe that you're inhabiting. In other words, Shakespeare would feel clunky if suddenly they started talking in prose. Because he has chosen as his natural state, the state of the poet. You have to, you choose your state within each play, and then you've got to make everything natural to it. And nothing should sound, for instance, like you're telling the audience something they need to know in order to understand what happens next.
Right.
It should all feel like stuff that's the way it would actually just sort of come up in conversation about something else, and finding that construction that feels natural, sort of like emulating the structure of a crystal, so that you can't tell the difference between the artificial crystal and a natural crystal.
You know, I remember you once saying to me, Stephen, you and I will never write a great tragedy because, you said something like, because we have the souls of a comedian or something like that.
No, we have a sense of humor.
Yeah.
True tragedy is utterly humorless, utterly. And that makes it very hard for the modern sensibility.
Is there a great modern tragedy that you can
Well,
point to
Death
this?
of a Salesman's pretty good, and it has a couple of laughs in it.
Has a few.
But when I was a young writer, I did not like Arthur Miller, because I thought he was one of these gray men from the 50s, and that he was paternalistic, and that he was holding forth the deep knowledge that he knew as an eminence and was sharing with me. And I am Irish, and I rebel. I cannot walk into a courtroom without feeling rage that there's a judge. I just want to, and the idea that somebody's sitting higher than me makes me want to burn down the building. And so I felt that Miller was sitting higher than me, and I didn't like that. More recently, I've revisited the material and go like, the guy was incredible.
Right.
He was incredible. But there was a worldview in the 50s that colors all of those plays from that time. And they're colored by the repression of the era in which they were fashioned. Just as, Sam Shepard's plays are colored by the feeling of like pushing off all of that stuff, and then the Shepard thing came to an end, and then something else came in. Just like, the commercial comedies that Neil Simon was writing were at first incredibly liberating, and then became a prison that he inhabited towards the very end, because he really hung tough for a long time.
Where does Tennessee Williams for you fall into that continuum of the old and the new?
If I had to pick, like, the two giants for me would be Eugene O'Neill and Tennessee Williams. They both were poets of a different stripe, and had experienced incredible emotional pain and found a way to metabolize it into something beautiful. O'Neill knew weird things about the theater, about, an experience that we all have as playwrights is that you go into a rehearsal room and the actors say the same things over and over again. They're saying the script and they're learning the script. And so they say the same things over and over again, which is the same thing as prayer. It's an incantation, and that sometimes something comes down into the room. And somehow O'Neill knew stuff about that, where, like in Iceman Cometh, he could repeat over and over things that then deepened and deepened the more that they were repeated, in a way that I find mysterious and very powerful. And with Tennessee Williams, he found a way, and I would say a freedom, to allow people to speak in poetry without you noticing, and to elevate the material in a beautiful, elegant, subtle way, where the audience at the same time could go, that's poetry, and yet I'm not in school. This is like the birth of poetry. This is in the early days, back when Homer was around, why poetry caught on in the first place.
Do you think courage can be taught, or is it something that you either...
If you're a writer, if you have a desire to write, your desire has to be stronger than your fear. And that chemical balance, I don't know that, there's something you can say that makes that be the case. But I always think it's just a very simple thing. It's like, you're gonna die, so let's get on with it. This is it, It's like those chess games with the clock, and then it's somebody else's turn. And so you got a certain amount of time to make your move. And like, let's get on with it. And the people who are paralyzed, they can't get on with it, it's like, it's your life, clock's ticking. Now, of course, that could cause massive anxiety and stuff.
That's another way. But
what are you gonna do? That's the truth of it.
because your work, your writing, that's one of the words is courageous. And that's what resonates for me. And I'm just curious, where did it come from?
I think that I certainly contained fear and faint-heartedness, and recognized that that was a very important thing for me to overcome, because I admired courage when I saw it, and when I saw it in literature, when I saw it in film, when I saw it in life. And that's who I wanted to be. It's what they say about Cary Grant. Cary Grant got a vision one day. He was Archie Leach, and he invented a guy named Cary Grant, and he decided to become that guy. And eventually, he became Cary Grant, and that's who he was. And I liked that idea, and I think that there's real truth in that idea, that that is what happens to people, that they either get a vision of who they want to be, a positive vision, and head towards that. And it doesn't matter whether it hurts or it's fun or it's terrible or it's depressing. They head towards that, and eventually they become that, what they wanted to become. And I think that more people should do that, I think. And it doesn't have to be about writing. They just should do that. They should, and people should help them do that when they're young.
I understand from what I've read and saw that in high school, a sort of a seminal experience for you was seeing or working backstage on a production of Cyrano. Can you talk a little bit about what it was about that experience, about that play, about that character that, turned the light on for you a little bit?
Sure. My brother Tom said, stage crew's fun. And so I joined stage crew, and I started building scenery. And the production that they were doing was of Cyrano de Bergerac. And it turned out that this was going to be a legendary production. And then the guy who played Cyrano, who was incredible, he had that poetry in his soul. And I would stand in the wings in the dark with these little lights, and everybody having to be quiet, because you're supposed to be quiet backstage so people can't hear you that are watching the play, and listen to this extraordinary poetry and take in this story about a guy who was a freak, and who was the toughest guy in the room, and who was a poet. And up until then, my idea of a poet was not the toughest guy in the room. And in that moment, I saw that my persona that I had developed in the Bronx to survive, and my soul, which was the soul of a poet, could co-inhabit the same frame. And
You sort of found a role model.
yeah, again, that word, freedom. I found a way to be a poet and feel free about it, and be something that people don't understand in this society that we're living in. Several years ago, I read something this young woman had written, and I said, "You're a poet." And that's a big responsibility, because you can do anything. You can have anything you want. You can do anything. And I knew what I meant by that, because a poet is like a necromancer who takes over the entire world and heaven and hell, takes over everything. You're a Dante, and you get to control the elements. When I wrote my first screenplay, about halfway through, the phone rang, and I stared at the phone, and I was really honestly puzzled. And I was puzzled because I hadn't told the phone to ring. And that's when I realized I'd lost my mind.
Right.
And at the same time that I was engaged in an amazing and wonderful pursuit. And that thing that I discovered in writing that screenplay, you can discover that in writing a play. You have the power of life and death over everybody. You have the color of the walls can change. You can do anything. You have control of the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the psychological, and the psychophysical. You can do anything. And what's more, socially, you can kind of do anything. Because once you truly take on the mantle of a poet, nobody can stop you. Because the world, society needs poets desperately, always does. And I'm not speaking as like some kind of educator who says, you know, the world needs poets. What I'm saying is people, men, women, children, old people, they all want you to connect them to something larger. And they'll do anything for you if you can give it to them.
Yeah. When you were watching Cyrano and the Wings, were you aware that you were having an experience that other people around you weren't having?
No. You know, in other words, I did not know I existed. I remember when I found out that I existed.
When was that?
And it was late. But I was a Cardinal Spellman. It was about a year later, and I had just been suspended from school, and I had just said in religion class that I didn't believe in God. And I had failed all 6 of my subjects, and I was going home with all 3 of those pieces of information on the same day. To my mother, who was not going to be amused.
Right.
And when I got to the corner of East Tremont and Beach Avenue, there was a candy store. And in the window of the candy store was a foil mirror that was there for reasons that are unclear to me. And I was walking by and I saw it and I stopped and I looked in the mirror and I spoke to myself. And I said, as long as you and I are okay, the rest is going to be fine. And I made a deal with myself that day. And I've kept the deal. I've kept the deal. I experienced huge bouts of guilt and shame and everything else, but never between me and me. I know why I've done everything I've done.
Well, then how can you, if it's not between you and you, then how can you experience shame if you're not experiencing shame over something you've done?
Societal shame. In other words, I would never, if I was Robinson Crusoe, one of my favorite fantasies ever, I'm alone on a island, tropical island. There's nobody else there, and I've built my hut, and I'm, fishing or whatever. Nothing I do would cause me shame. It's the eyes of others that make you feel shame. You project it out, perhaps, but if they weren't there, you wouldn't do it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's getting right to the heart, to me, of a theme that you come back to in your writing. And I remember saw Doubt twice, but I remember opening night of Doubt. Me and Phil watched it, and I was like, I think that this play, in some ways, is about John's attempt to justify or excuse any bad behavior, because as long as the concept of doubt is a valid one, then everything becomes, well, really, what is shame and what is right and what is wrong? Is there any truth to that?
No. I mean, the most central experience that I had that engendered the play was I went to a private school in New Hampshire, and I was very troubled. I was 15. I'd been thrown out of a bunch of schools, and I was very widely read, but I didn't really get to talk about what I'd read much, and I was violent. And I was suddenly in this tiny boys' school on top of a mountain in New Hampshire, and a teacher took me under his wing, and he protected me, and he educated me. He was the head of the English department, and he recognized that I was gifted, but he was a predator, and he didn't prey on me, all around me, but not me. And I didn't know that. I sensed all sorts of things,
Right.
but I didn't know that at all. And I was I think, in denial about it because I needed him to survive in that school. They would have thrown me out. And then many years later, there was a reunion. There hadn't been a reunion in 30 years. So I saw these guys as, teenagers, and then the next time I saw them as gray-haired men. And at that reunion, I found out for certain that he had been a predator, and I talked to more than one person who'd been victimized. And he was there. And then a year later, I got a letter, and it was from him. And I looked at the envelope, and I put it in my bag, and I drove to my country house, and I lit a fire and turned on the lamp and sat down. And I knew what the letter was going to say. I knew the letter was going to say that he was dying because I was psychically connected to him. And I read the letter, and that's what it said. And he asked me to come and see him. And I threw the letter in the fire and said, I will not visit him, even though I am grateful, because he has done something that was too bad, and I can't do that. And that ambivalence and contradictory feeling about somebody who had been good to me, but had done terrible things, I couldn't reconcile it. And so those questions surrounding that idea of that predator and how I felt about it had a lot to do with why I wrote Doubt. That and a changing world. I grew up in a changing world. The 60s I found to be, in many ways, catastrophic. My neighborhood was destroyed in the 60s, and it was basically swept away within 5 years of when I left. And the nuns were going to be swept away. Penmanship was going to be swept away. Classics departments were going to close all across the United States. So Doubt was about all of that stuff. It's about when you're in a situation where you sense, and I did sense when I was 12 years old, this whole world is coming to an end. And when I left the Bronx, when I was 19, I took one long look back because I knew it wasn't going to be there when I came back after the Marine Corps.
Is there ever a scenario you could imagine where you would sacrifice the work and what you do for something else out of either necessity or whatever?
Well, I made a decision a long time ago that my children came first, and also that my life comes first. And the degradation of my work would be considerably less important than the degradation of my soul. That's pretty clear to me. And, I write now. I've written for many years. I could do something else. In other words, I would be exercising.
What would you do?
I would be exercising this, which is the creative act. But I can do it in other ways. In other words, I could lose the part of yourself that feels heavy. In many, many activities, I could paint. And even though I have no particular gifts that I know of, I'm like, I think I could do something with that. So there's other stuff that might satisfy it. But I am a born playwright. And what does that cost me? The world hurts. People hurt. Everything that has to do with interacting with this mortal existence is painful. And so the price that I've paid as a playwright is, I have my thing that I do at home that I might have a certain level of comfort and safety and exhilaration doing it. But then I insist on taking it out of the house and putting it up in front of people where it will crash and burn in flames and I'll be ridiculed in public. Very painful. And an absolutely necessary part of the process. But if I were, working in an office, I would suffer more. But I feel that the price is very low in terms of what I've gotten to do in comparison to what a lot of other people have had to do.